me. There we go. So I hit record. There we go. So, but yes, thanks to Eric. Okay. So sorry if my hand keeps coming in front of the camera, everybody. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm. Let me see. All right, there we go.
So there's a message coming up on mine where you have to say I got it or leave the meeting. The account owner can watch this recording if it's stored in the cloud. Participants granted permission record and share.
What's that?
You have to say you're okay to be recorded. That's it.
Oh, yes. Okay, so all right, so I think I've spotlit myself. I've hit record. I think I'm going through my checklist here. Okay, so I think we should be all set. So good morning. Good morning, everybody. So periodically you just might see my hand. Whoops. All right. How do I just want to, oh, you know what I can do? I'm going to, all right. See, now I feel smart when I remember how to do something very simple. So let me just, I figured out how to airdrop something into the school computer, and I felt like Bill Gates for the rest of the day. It's pretty, my bar is pretty, it's pretty low here. So I'll turn the waiting room off here, so that way people will just be able to kind of come in. And let me just also make sure that I have people mute upon entry, so that way people don't forget. Okay. All right. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us on this Sunday morning, or yeah, for me it's morning anyway. So I'm Garrett Vitanza, Principal Instructor at the Academy of Real Estate Boston, for those of you who don't know me. And joining us today is Cindy MacMillan, the founder and director of the Academy of Real Estate Boston. And today, so we are doing an AMA, or Ask Me Anything, and I've done one of these before, and I know that all the other instructors, everybody does it a little differently. So the way that I had people do it last time was either typing their question in the chat or putting their hand up, and that way I was going to either just repeat the question out loud or just unmute you, and then you ask your question. If there's anything in particular that might require any images, I might not be able to do. So that I know last time I think I was asked to critique a painting, and unfortunately I just don't have the setup to do that in real time. It also would take a long time too. That usually takes, at least for me anyway, takes about half an hour. So for everybody else, it might be a little boring. Okay, so actually I did see a question come in. And so if you guys are asking a question, if you could also, if it's specifically for Cindy or myself, if you could also just specify that, but you will probably both have commentary on it anyway, so it probably won't be necessary. So Carmela asks, could you go over colors for a low chroma portrait? Yep, absolutely. So limited can mean quite a few different things. So for us at the school, a classical kind of limited palette is, well, the most limited, I guess, would be using what are called the primaries, a yellow, a red, and a blue. A classical version of that is what's commonly referred to as the Zorn palette, which is the same idea. So you're using a blue, a yellow, and a red, but they are more classical. So instead of like an ultramarine blue, you're using an ivory black. You're using yellow ochre instead of like a cad yellow, for example. And you're using cad red, which maybe is the exception there. That is really kind of in theme with what you think of. It's like a fire hydrant red, that prime red. And so that's one extremely classical kind of limited palette that a lot of people tend to like, because the nice thing about limited palettes is it limits how many combinations you can mess up, or it limits how much you can mess up. And if the options of screwing up our limited, it kind of helps you to get back on track because there's less combinations to have to go through. I personally, so I actually have a friendly kind of debate about this with some of my students when they do the first uh, limited palette assignment in their projects, which is their limited palette cast painting. And I have students who do like to use the Zorn palette for that. And I do have a bit of a, and it's perfectly fine, but I do feel like for me, a more well-rounded limited palette are those same three colors, ivory black, yellow ochre. I also prefer Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre, which is a personal thing. I think Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre is superior because it's orangier. I find that yellow ochre in general and yellow ochre light tends to kind of go greeny on me, almost like a virgin olive oil kind of coloring. So I find that Blue Ridge Yellow Ochre, which is a type of yellow ochre, not a brand. It's from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia and is it North Carolina, I think. So different brands do have it. So I do like that. And Cad Red. So sorry, I got off topic. So ivory black, yellow ochre, Cad Red, and the two other additions that I think make it a more well-rounded limited palette are raw umber and burnt umber. And some students in general like to really limit themselves and just go with the three. But I do find it very difficult to get dark values with high chroma if your only darkening option is really just black. You're really kind of limited. And the idea there is that you have, again, your primary blue, ivory black, yellow, yellow ochre, and red, Cad Red. But so you have a high chroma version of those colors, and then you have a low chroma version. So you have Cad Red, burnt umber, yellow ochre, raw umber. So a dark yellow and a red yellow. I also think it's more well-rounded, especially for a portrait, because burnt umber and white and raw umber and white are, I mean, they're pretty close to a flesh color, just straight out of the 2+ white. I mean, it's not for everybody, but it is like a dull orange that can be flavored accordingly, a little bit yellower, redder, and classically that is the case. Is that a lot of the paintings in antiquity would be predominantly like a red ochre with lead white, ivory black, and then occasionally something else to adjust its intensity. But then you could also do a limited palette that's warm cool based or complementary based, where you're using like a red and a green, or a warm cool like a blue and a yellow or something like that. But yeah, I mean, so so there are options there, but I think that generally those are some of uh, the ones that rush to mind. Cindy, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with all that. That's I've made portrait paintings with those colors before. The only thing that I do is I take the yellow ochre and the black and I mix a green. And then that's kind of what I use for my cools. And rather than the black, I don't really ever like dip into black and mix it with any of those other colors. I use the green instead.
Do you find mixing tertiary secondary colors really helpful on the list? Because I go back and forth on that sometimes. Like if you're using that same limited palette, so not only mixing a green, but do you find like taking the yellow ochre and Cad Red to make an orange, and then the red and the blue or the black to make a purple, and having those all kind of pre-made? Or do you find yourself like not kind of mixing them as needed?
So I love to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I frequently waste a lot of paint doing that, but I like having it there so that when I'm painting, then it's like I can just dip into it as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to having to mix so many things. So I kind of mix neutrals out of a lot of the combinations.
Yeah,
Just
I
faster to me. Like if I do it ahead of time and then it's there.
mhm. Yeah, I to me it's just it's something that it's kind of one of those things that you kind of go back and forth on doing, because it's one of those moments where you sometimes put all that effort in, and then
You don't
it's
use
close to
it.
it's close to the end of the painting day, and you're like, I didn't even touch this at all.
You know.
But then there are times where it's like, yeah, you definitely, I wish I keep running out of this orange. I wish I had spent 5 minutes just doing that. um
I don't mix a lot of them unless like when I'm mixing and I'm like, oh, this is going to be great. I love this color. And then I'll make a little bit more, but it's not generally a lot of paint,
mhm.
but I do like having it.
Yeah, and to me it also just helps, especially when you're limited. It maybe helps a harmony of sorts where you're not having to, you can calibrate your orange so that it is really a neutral between the red and the yellow, and stuff like that. I think it's also, I think mixing though is just good practice. I just think, um when I remember being a student. I remember Fernando made me mix a string of black and a string of raw umber separately, and our task was to mix the right value and the right neutral for everything, instead of mixing the neutral in a pile, and then string that pile. Um, and I think that the over the years, I think that
Harder.
it's way harder, and I think that what happens there is it very easily almost becomes a warm cool assignment, because it's really easy to see deviations from day to day. Um, and I remember being a younger student and first starting at the atelier, and I remember walking around and seeing some paintings that were supposed to be in grisaille, but I remember them looking suspiciously warm at moments or cool in moments, and I
Yeah.
didn't know why that was. But I think that when you're first starting on a value centric assignment, because just taking that one variable away can make all the difference between some folks being able to digest the lessons and some just being, yeah, this is just a more of an encumbrance than anything.
But
um
making those kind of like errors or like seeing that you like there's so much variation and it's hard to get that neutral is really informative at like how
mhm.
much you're getting out of just a small little change in a paint mixture. I think it's a good thing to go through.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think so too. I mean, the towards the end of last term, one of the things I was talking to one of the student, actually, I got a really nice gift from one of my students. They bought a lithograph of a Barg lithograph, and they gifted it to me. One of the newer prints that they're doing now. I forget where you can. I forget where you. I don't know if it's the Dehesh Museum or who, but they've started like reprinting them sort of, and so and that led on to the topic that how I did Bargs before the book came out, and there was just more documentation on Barg. Is that we had a photo album of different Bargs with different exposure levels, and you'd go through that and take a page. And I mean, I remember, like, compared to what we do now, it was really rough. Like, I remember, like, having 4 or 5 different photos taped to my board, and this was my halftone photo,
For the
this is my
dark.
shadow
Yeah,
photo. Yeah. And so
exactly.
and I would imagine you had a similar experience when
All
you
the
were doing
same, like we
yours.
get a little like 4x5 photograph.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And
Yeah.
on the one hand, I was like, I'm so jealous, because first of all, you just had options that weren't available to me. Like, I didn't know half these Bargs existed. Um, and second of all, you just have the resolution to be able to push yourself to go really far.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I do have to say, it was really it made you think more. Like, you couldn't afford to sit back at all. Like, you had to be a really active, engaged person, participant. Otherwise you would be led astray really quickly. And I felt like that somehow prepared you a little bit for being more of a painter, where, especially like in your perishable assignment, where that's really the name of the game. It's taking different references and then Frankensteining them into a believable kind of singular thing.
Yeah, I think of it
um
as like sort of the same philosophy for parenting children or whatever. It's like, yeah, you're supposed to let them go out in the world and get lost in the woods and try to find their way home. And then
yeah,
Like
with
somehow
dirt.
you're building a better child that way. It was like the same sort of thing when you were had
Yeah,
to read
that's yeah.
photograph.
Sometimes I do hear myself. I'm like, right. I'm like, we had it tougher and we were better for it, kind of a thing. And I'm like, ooh. Um, but I do think that when you're like, but that like, I mean, that's a question that I often get asked is like, so one thing that I often get asked by beginner students is why don't we tone in the shadows sooner because it makes things easier. And the answer is in the question. It's like, well, right, it's easier, so that's why we don't do it. It's like by making a really careful linear prescript like rehearsal for the outline of a shadow and taking that as far as you can and then toning it in. um you're really forcing your eye to it's lifting up more weights essentially. So yeah, it's harder, but that's the purpose. Like that's
Yeah,
the its
exactly.
purpose is to be hard essentially. um let's see, anybody else have any questions that they had specifically? So
Thank you,
anybody
Garrett.
who
Thank you, guys.
Oh yeah, you're welcome, Carmela. Just anybody who just newly came into the chat. So just the one thing that I won't be able to do is critique any paintings in real time. So I did get asked that I think last time, and unfortunately, it's a little too cumbersome to do that kind of in real time, essentially. Um, but so I remember. So actually, uh, one question that I have actually is so when I was a student, I remember Fernando said that one of the biggest and most important assignments in the program was the last barg. I don't know if you ever heard him say that. He thought the fourth barg was just so important.
Yeah.
Um, did he ever tell you why? Because this is one of those things that like it's like, well, Dad always told me this, but he never really gave me the full answer as to why.
He
I
never
believe
gave
him.
me the answer either.
Oh no?
I'm
Okay.
guessing it's like a little bit of sticking with it, maybe like the
Yeah,
discipline of doing another one even though you don't want to, or I think that might be part of it.
yeah. I guess it kind of helps to solidify the practice or something like that. I'm assuming anyway. But I was a little surprised. I just I remember even like later stage projects he did not treat with as much reverence as that fourth barg. He just like even when other teachers or even Colleen would suggest, well, they're kind of demonstrating an ability where maybe they don't need to do the fourth one. They can just go to. He would just like staunchly say like
Oh yeah.
no, yeah,
Yeah.
and he's like it's just too important. And I'm like, oh well, why?
Yeah, I mean, he said
um,
the same thing to me. So when we were doing the whole Founders College in South Virginia, and
mhm.
he was talking about, what the students, I should have the students do and all that kind of stuff. And that he did say that like repeatedly. It's almost like it's like a very important thing to him. Like you said, maybe the more
Yeah,
important.
like there's I have to next time I see him, I'm gonna be like, what barg hurt you? Like what like where like where does this come from? Because that was like he just would not relent on that. Um,
Maybe
the
we should
only other
bring him on to an AMA and confront him.
oh God,
An
we'd have
AMA
to lure.
intervention.
Well, he would probably just well, we'd have to trick him to come on and tell him that we were gonna. It's about Swiss Chalet or something he could talk about endlessly, like or it's about hockey or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I did see a question coming from Lauren Farrell. So Lauren says, "Hi Garrett and Cindy, can you talk about developing an individual point of view, especially moving beyond academic exercises? Are there things that you did to grow your individual practice styles?" Yeah, that's a really that's actually a really important and a tough question because I think that, there in that book by Albert Boehm, and he talks about uh, he talks about the stages of apprenticeship as a student in the 19th century and before that in the medieval era. And the term for when you were basically the apprentice has reached a point of practice where the master has said you can basically go out on your own and establish yourself and develop your own studio. You know, you fulfilled your contract because you would have to sign a contract at that time. Um, you were called a journeyman after that, and the whole idea was that you were supposed to go out into the world and actually collect objects that you would gather. So, like Dürer, for example, he documents his journeyman period, and um, that journeyman period, or the period like after you've maybe wrapped up your formal kind of education. um that is actually a very difficult, it is really, if you think about kind of analogous to one's own evolution of growth, as a it's a kind of, okay, now go out and live on your own, is that there's an adjustment period of not having that reliable resource of criticism and support that like your parents provide, or in this instance your instructors provide. And you're just left with nobody else in the room but you when questions pop up, and that does it, there is, and I think there's also an adjustment period of when, and this is also why I try to make this point very clear from the beginning when people study, you know, with me, is that what the academic process or what I'm teaching you here is not meant to replace your intuition. And you weren't drawn wrongly before, you weren't doing anything wrong, but we're just trying to organize your impulses better through kind of, I used to, there's not bad habits, there's just bad timing. So it's like it's like you can see all this detail, that's great, but just don't do that early, kind of a thing. So I mean, I think for me personally, I think there are, I guess there are two things that I found helpful. I can speak, you know, or two or three things that I found helpful as individually. One was looking a lot, and I say this about a lot of aspects of painting, is I think you should approach it like as if you're a director. You have to go to the movies a lot and see movies as well as make them. And I think it's the same thing for painters, where it's, you know, I always bother my students with like, have you gone to the MFA recently? Because we have this great museum that's very close, as well as the Isabella, and you're able to see, because so painting is really, you're making an object, and to see the intricacy of, it's like looking at a well-made cabinet almost. And if you need to see that in person to really see how the craftsmanship is. And so I think one thing is going to museums a lot, and really looking at things that you really like and not being satisfied with, I just like it because I like it. That you have to kind of ask your, like, look under the skin a little bit as to why you like it. And things you don't like, and with the same level of analysis, why don't I like this? Is it too remedial? Is it too simple? Is it just too non-figurative and I just really like the figure? It's that's it. And so that all helps to formulate a sense of taste, which is really something that can't be taught, it can just be cultivated. um, and there's no wrong answers there. It's just developing what you like and don't like. I think doing copies is a great thing. And I think when you're doing a copy, remind yourself that you're doing a copy of something you like to do, that you like aesthetically. Um, and when you're doing that copy, try to really put yourself in that mindset of like, what problems would I be encountering if I had this set up in front of me, and things like that. Um, we learn by imitation. So just by going through the experience of doing a copy of something that you resonate with visually, it does help you to look under the hood and look at the technical aspects, the working innards of what makes it tick. And that helps to kind of, now that you have a certain set of skills that you've developed over years of training, you're able to slightly demystify that experience and understand what are the things, the shapes, the colors, and values that all collectively create this experience that I'm so attracted to. Um, and I also think looking at and the last thing I would say is looking at painting from another discipline, I find to be really helpful. I think sometimes if you look at it, like I just was saying earlier, if you approach painting like thinking of it like a director doing a movie, sometimes you're too close to it to really see some things objectively. And sometimes when you, I think Van Gogh said, to know one discipline thoroughly is to know all potentially, or something, words to the effect, where it's like, if you know one system very thoroughly, you can kind of apply that same formula to other disciplines and kind of understand them to some extent. And I think uh, that's the beauty of kind of the academic process, or at least the way we teach it, is that it's not, we don't really emphasize a singular point of view, like a certain aesthetic, like, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful manner. Like when people study with Odd Nerdrum, I know they have, because they paint like him, because through osmosis they develop the way, his lens of viewing the world. But when we're instructing, it's more just a more benign way of how to see things properly. And I think that that allows you then to look at other techniques and identify, oh, they're doing this, and I like that, except, you know, that part of their process and stuff like that. So yeah, I would say, sort of, to just consolidate all that, I would say to go to the excuse me, go to museums more and look a lot more at things that you like, and ask yourself why you like those and really dissect them. I would be doing copies for the for the same reason. And thinking of the discipline, but through another avenue, just to kind of help see things a little bit more objectively. But also just be patient with yourself. This is one of those things that it's like your handwriting. It's just, if you're trying to look for a visual identity, it's one of those things that happens when you're not looking for it. It's like your handwriting. It's already there. The more you paint, the more it comes through. I think the more you go in search of it, the more it hides, and you're not going to find it, kind of a thing. But yeah, I kind of got off on a tangent. Cindy, do you have anything to add to that? It's a good question. It's a tough thing to answer.
I don't know if I'm going to have a helpful comment about that
Mm-hmm.
because I don't feel like I've done that ever in my life. I don't have, I'm on a
Ditto.
journey
Yeah.
all the time. I like
Mm-hmm.
learning. I like trying different things. So I've done like a variety of projects in my lifetime. So I've done pottery. I've built a sea grotto. I've
That's right.
painted. I've sculpted. I do weird planar studies of things. I can spend hours and hours trying to figure out what are the planes on a bird.
You've done fashion.
I mean, I've done fashion stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I can't, I guess it's like try to know yourself. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and that's hard to do. So I think about, I mean, I had periods in my artistic life where I was like frustrated because I would make some paintings and I would want to like get gallery representation. I thought that was the thing that I wanted to do, and I couldn't quite figure out how to navigate that. But now when I look back, I never really wanted to do that because I don't like making a whole bunch of paintings that are kind of all not similar, but you know, have a thing about them. They have a look to them or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I I have no patience for that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not what interests me. So I guess my advice would be try to look inward and understand yourself as far as what appeals to you and even trying things. So like if your goal is, okay, I want to find myself so that I have a body of work that I can then approach a gallery with, and I can do like a series over a period of 5 years, and I'll do, you know, 10 small paintings and 10 large paintings and maybe some
Mm-hmm.
prints or whatever. And that'll be like my body of work. Like you have to sort of figure that out. And if you think that you know it, then you just start doing it and then be open to figuring out along the way, is this really what I want to do? I don't know. I don't think I have a very helpful answer for that.
No, I think, well, it is just one of those things where I guess there's really, um, I think this is where it's really, it's because this is where it's so unacademic, like where there's not that set structure where follow these steps and you get these results. It's because there's just so many, you know, wildly different factors. And I think that, you know, when being a representational painter is somebody who, you know, aspires to have that type, or who's attracted to that type of work personally. I think that if you're a realist painter today, I think one of the challenges that you face is you really do have to confront art history in both the sense that um, there's a tremendous weight of it, and a lot of what you're doing can be seen and is seen as being somewhat archaic and um, trite,
Repetitive or
right, repetitive. And I think and I think that's and this is where I always have beef with a lot of representational painters, is that because they approach it from a point of view where modern art generally is just all bad and all that, which I don't agree with. But um, I think that a lot of representational painters feel like they have to either conform and adopt a conservative sense of taste, and they kind of emulate or regurgitate formulas from the past, but eventually they kind of, I mean, to me, and this is going to sound very catty, but to me, they kind of sometimes look like adults playing dress up, where it's kind of, nude people in strange places with fabric for some reason, because they're drawn to that look in art history, like Olympia, for example, and they want to do that, and they think that putting that in a contemporary setting is very kind of all that's needed. To me, it demonstrates a certain limited understanding um, of art history in general, I guess. I don't know. So that's where I kind of like, and that's probably more talking about the snob in me a little bit, I guess. Um, but but to get back to your question, Lauren, it's one of those things that's very. I think the biggest thing to do would be just to keep working. I think that one of the, and when I say keep working, I really just mean keep painting. I think that um, this is one of the things that can really be detrimental to a painter's growth, is just paralysis by analysis, where you kind of are aware of so many options and you just get so overwhelmed that you freeze, and you kind of then effectively just don't do anything because you're afraid of misstep. And that's kind of the, I guess, the cost of the training that you get, is you kind of, with the education, you kind of know all the ways you can mess up, right? So like before you're trained, you don't know how to do things properly, but you kind of don't know the rules that you're breaking. So there's a certain freedom within that. So you're kind of you're kind of kind of learning all that. But I do think that by just painting and just by kind of doing it over, that's where, honestly, again, where repetition is really key. It's one of those things that kind of just happens naturally. But I think, again, being self-aware is really key too. It's not one of those things that just by doing it absent-mindedly over and over again, like you have to really be introspective, and as critical as you were about technical things, now you have to be as critical about aesthetics and taste and judgment. And those are and those are not teachable, because there's no wrong answers. There's just really experience, and you have to cultivate it, essentially.
and don't you think though you can also um analyze your own paintings or your own drawings and then find a genuine aspect to the subject matter sometimes? So when you make a painting, you can sort of look at it and go, yeah, that subject is something I care about, or it's something I feel strongly about, or it represents me in
Mm-hmm.
even in sort of a weird way. So I'm thinking about like a painting I made where it was about how much I love coffee.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
do love coffee. And so
Mm-hmm.
that painting is just, I like that painting because it has a genuine meanness to it. So I
Mm-hmm.
think if you can look at any of your work that you've done, and if you can sort of find some of those things, then maybe you can figure out how to direct them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think um and I think just really being open to things too. I think that there's a certain kind of at least for me, when I think about being, kind of fresh out of my like atelier training too, it's like you really do feel like you have to honor that and keep in line with it, and you're not really open-minded to certain things because they don't feel like they're in step with that mold of taste. um but there's like a lot of there's a lot of great academic paintings of antiquity that were not done in the reverential settings that we really think about. I mean, it's, like there's a painting that Rembrandt did. It's a beautiful painting of a man holding a bird upside down in a doorway. And it's really a rude painting. To us, it actually seems quite pleasant and beautiful. But the type of bird the man's holding, and it's actually a gesture to have sex. I mean, if it were in English, the equivalent of the bird's name would be to, to F-U-C-K. So that's really what it means. So it's actually a very rude painting in that in that time period. But by our standards, like, oh, that's really pretty. But it would have been a very cheeky joke at the time. So I think that there, or like the or even like, I mean, another really different example is, the death of Mara, pure propaganda for an awful time period. And David's painting it with the corpse of the man in front of him, and it's decomposing, and he had a skin issue to begin with. So he really has to beautify him. And I think it's in summer, so he's decomposing in these, like, in the warm months and all this stuff. So like, not saying that you should be open to painting from the dead. That's not what that's not what I'm saying. But basically, what I'm saying is that just being open to different, just being open and not having maybe preconceived notions about what subjects and what taste levels are required to make a good painting, essentially.
Don't you also think there's like a heartbreak component to being an artist that's always there? Like the wondering if what you're doing is good, wondering if, like, what people would say about this, wondering, if, like, I also think like there's a lot of pressure to show that you're successful at it. And I feel like there's a little bit of angst and heartache that's just part of being an artist.
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially in today's society, we derive a lot of our self-worth from like that sense of accomplishment and product. And I think that when we don't have that, because sometimes I think when you make a painting and things don't go well, it's valuable, but you just don't have a product you can point to. The value is the lessons you've gathered from the mistakes, but you don't have that physical thing to say, to show people that you've done work. Like, I'm not, like, look, I actually have done something.
Yeah.
And I think that does that's it is a really kind of a tragic. I remember Rothko saying that too. He said, like, he calls it the tragic notion of the image, because not only from the outlook that you propose, but also that a painting lives by companionship. It needs to be looked at to be a painting completely. It's kind of like that, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, kind of a question. But Rothko proposes that it's really tragic that if the painting's not observed, it's not really fully a painting. It lives by companionship, I think he called it. But I remember when we were at the track conference years ago, and there was that a brain scientist person, to be specific, and I remember he gave this super long lecture that was super complicated and nobody could really follow it. But I was grateful for this one person who had the courage at the end of the lecture to stand up and say, so what would be one takeaway for a painter to have after everything you said? Which I really appreciated, because I kind of was wondering the same thing. And he said that for artists to accept that the image you see in your head will never be what happens on the canvas, because it's an impossibility. You will never be. And he did go through a lengthy, again, I can't remember, explanation why this whole idea of the potential of perfection, or the fantasy of it, is always superior than the actuality, essentially. I'm paraphrasing. And I remember Josh, I think it was Reynolds, who said something similar, where it's like the real artwork is the idea. The painting is just like the second hand, the closest record to the actual artwork as possible. And the real artwork dies with the painter. And the idea that it sounds a little pessimistic, But I actually, when I really realize that, it's actually quite liberating. It's like, oh, well, if it's never going to meet that imaginary fantasy of perfection, oh, then you kind of, I don't know, it kind of,
Freeze you
uh,
up a little bit.
a little bit. Yeah. It's a little bit like when you're making that transition from drawing to painting and you're learning to lose drawing, and how that feels so scary because you've been trained to be so dependent on it. But and you realize that the letting go of the drawing is more liberating for you to make decisions, not confining you. But it takes a little bit of experience again to really understand that.
Yeah.
But that I think about. Yeah.
Um, I also think it's good to have people you can bounce stuff off of. So I was making a painting a couple of years ago, and I was down in Boston, and I brought the color study with me, and I just showed it to Julie, and I said, "What do you think this is about? What do you think about this thing
I
over in
remember
the left-hand corner? What do you
I
think that
remember this.
is?"
Yeah.
Because I know what I thought it looked like.
Yeah.
But I learned a lot by what she thought it looked like. And then
Right.
the other thing is sometimes I just get my family in and even my grandkids, I'm like, does that does that look like grandma? That picture, that painting?
I,
And
honestly,
you know who that is? And they're
uh,
very honest, and you can learn things just by like, because it's all about communicating. I mean, you're painting something
totally.
to communicate. So you've got to find out how people are reading it.
Hmm.
I also remember like when I did my final critique for the New York Academy of Art. So they had like, I don't know, 5 New York artists come in and they looked at our painting, and one of the guys, he was just saying stuff. And I was like, I can't believe that's in that painting. I feel like he's reading me.
Hmm.
There's something about me in that painting that I didn't know was there. It was so
Hmm.
weird. So it's good to get other people's opinions.
Yeah, and I think that the so-called untrained eye, the casual observer, is very telling because they're not in it, so they're so objective, and they'll just tell that's successful or nope, that doesn't work. Because when you're really, into the technical side of it, you can kind of convince yourself of certain, or you can just get too in it that you just don't see those things that are so blatantly obvious to somebody who doesn't really know what to look for, essentially. Um, like there was this winner of this portrait competition. Okay, I'm not going to say who it is or what year it was or what award it was, but there was a portrait competition some time ago where there was a winner and it was a full length portrait, and there was something about it that was, I was like, there's some, overall it was very well done, but there was something about it that was bugging me and I didn't like it. And my husband looked over and said, "Oh, well, the wrinkles on the jeans, it's like they took a rubber stamp and it's like the same shapes." And it's exactly what it was. It was like the pant wrinkle design was it was a mirror image on both sides, and it just threw everything off. Um, but I thought it was something more complicated, like color harmony or like the layering of space wasn't quite right, or something, something like that. Um, yeah, Dale, that's the so Dale just chimed in saying, "I remember you saying jeans." Yeah, that's the same painting. So casuals that's always really, and that ultimately, you are painting for, it is about a visual communication. I think that, I mean, everybody defines for themselves what art is and what, but to me, a great painting, it's one of those things that kind of, like math, is a universal language, and you don't need to know the context. You don't, it just kind of like hits you on a very primal level, and it might not have anything to do, like the painting, like there's the painting of, by, oh shoot, Delaroche, is it the execution of Lady Jane Grey, is that Delaroche? I can't remember. But the execution of Lady Jane Grey is this enormous painting, and I'm pretty sure it's by Delaroche. And it's really, um, yeah, thank you, Dale. It is really, it depicts an horrible moment of this young woman about to be beheaded, but it is so, like, when I remember first seeing it, I remember gasping because I thought it was so beautifully sad. It was just kind of like a Lana Del Rey song. It was just it was just like, this is so beautiful. but it's really depicting an awful moment. And of course, the figures are life size. It's practically like you're watching a play because it's like they're on a stage. But I didn't need to know any context, and I knew what the painting was about. And so I think that that's kind of one of the great, like if you have to explain, I guess that's one of the things, if you have to explain, and this is where people differ dramatically. It's like if you have to explain it, it doesn't work. And that's causes a big schism kind of in people, in art people in general. When I was at the museum school, there was you would sign up for you could sign up for a lottery, and the winning prize was you got a critique from the museum's curator would actually come and critique your paintings. And I listened in on this one critique somebody got, and I heard, like, I'll never forget, because it was a good jab, but it was she said, so this guy was talking about like his process and just like showing off the work. And so she came in and kind of looked around, and she just, said, okay. She goes, well, your process is fascinating, but process is like gravy, and gravy doesn't make a meal. And that's all she said. And I was just,
for nothing offspring. But this is nothing more than pain.
He's gone.
Yeah, I think his internet. Oh, there it is.
Oh, yes. You back?
oh, sorry. Yes. Was there a lapse there in audio?
The last thing I heard was gravy.
Oh, yeah. So, sorry. The curator was saying that your process is interesting, but process is like gravy, and gravy doesn't make a meal. That was like what she said, and then she just turned around and left. And what her insult meant was that his intentions were not coming through, and he was relying on the uniqueness of his application to kind of carry his thesis. And because of that, she thought it was a failure. But some people, to Cindy's point, there are things that maybe somebody doesn't intend on, but somebody else comes away with. So is that a failure, or is that, like that's where there's a big debate on intentionality, and that being the success or determining the success or failure. I disagree with it. I think that just like Rothko said, it's defined by like the viewer always kind of completes the picture in a way with what they bring to it, essentially.
Okay,
sorry,
so that was a really long answer to what.
Yeah, sorry, I did see.
We went on and on.
Thank
you. That was great.
Yeah. Oh, you're welcome. I do see another question here that I was literally just about to say. No, there was another question here. This is from Myra. What are your recommendations for starting a career as a painter? On one hand, one has to train and improve their skills, but on the other hand, one needs to create and produce work that people will like and want to buy. How can I find people who are interested in buying my work? If I am an emerging artist, how should I price my work? And what other ways of making a living as a painter besides working with a gallery? Well, so all really good questions. Some are difficult to answer. Well, I will say, and I'm just a big proponent of it. I will say that it's, I would say that, training first is really essential. I really do think that, I think you need to learn the alphabet before you can start composing words, let alone sentences. So I think and this is really, again, if your aspirations are to be a representational painter or someone who has a realistic kind of flair to their work, especially, I do think that there is a lot of training. So you do need to invest in yourself and invest in your abilities. And I think you do um, I'm really trying to hold off on a Star Wars quote here, but because Luke Skywalker says ability without training is nothing, but I'm not going to say it. And but I do think that does count for a lot. So I will say that, and this is where Julie would really be somebody to really answer this question a bit more completely. But what I will say about the whole business side of things is that, with the advent of Instagram, the internet, YouTube, I know plenty of artists who make their living without having any connections with galleries because they are, oh, Julie, oh, you're here.
Hello.
Oh, wait, are you
Hello,
here?
my friends. I am here.
We've
Did you
only
hear the
answered
last-
one question so far.
Two, I think, but I thought this would be you would be a great person to add your input on. So Myra is asking on recommendations for starting a career as a painter, and how to strike a balance between improving one's skills and also producing enough of work that people will be interested in buying. How do you find that market? And how do you price? And and how do you make a living without having connections to a gallery?
Yeah, so there's a lot packed into that question.
Right.
But I will say that there's kind of multifaceted answers to this, and part of this relies on who you are as a person and how you relate to finances, believe it or not. So I can give you two examples. I am somebody who lives life with a lot of fear, and I don't like uncertainty. So when I first started realizing what I was capable through my training, I was always painting on the side, right? So I always had a job that was paying my bills. Like I was always self-sufficient. I never had anybody I could really rely on financially to float me for a while. So I just was always working. I was freelancing. And so when I felt like, the training is what showed me what was possible for myself, because before training, I was selling on Etsy for like $50. That's not like sustainable as a career. And in the long run, I thought I wanted to be able to just paint. And that was going to be like, that would be my ideal. But as I started getting into the point where my work was excelling, I was getting trained, and I was working an outside job, doing freelance work. And I know other people who maybe work at frame shops or related things. It was actually a pretty big wake up call for me that my relationship to painting and money was different than somebody who I think could be totally comfortable relying only on sales for a living, because I like a certain amount of certainty. So as I was starting to switch over my career from freelance to art-based, I did not want my creativity to have the responsibility to make something that would sell. I was only creatively driven if I knew I was making something that I truly loved and cared about, and I don't care if it sells. So as I was swapping that over, I knew I needed something that was art related to pay the majority of my bills. And if sales happens, then great, that's icing on the cake. Right. So that's because of my relationship with money, my relationship with my art practice. On the flip side of that, I know I have a few friends. One of them is Natalie Featherston. She's a very successful, very, prolific artist. And she made the cut dramatically. And she just said, I'm diving into the deep waters. I have to make this work. So she works 6 to 7 days a week, painting 10 hours a day, and she loves it. Right. So, and she is totally fine managing the ups and downs, and she's just, a hustler. So her relationship with it was like, I just need to make the cut. I'm going to do whatever it takes to make this happen. And she's totally fine knowing that like I've got to make 20 paintings for my solo show next year, and she's just gonna sit down and bang it out. You know, not everybody has that relationship with their creativity, with their work, and with finances that they feel comfortable doing that. So I do think the first step is really investing in yourself, like Garrett was talking about, investing in yourself and trying to make sure that you're doing not the best work you can be ever, but like you're kind of confidently on the path of what you want your work to be, because that's a scary and uncertain place, because you have to be willing to try drastically different things to feel out who you are as an artist. And it's a little bit more responsible for you to say, okay, I think I really feel I know what I want to be making and how I want to be making it. So this is now sustainable and a little bit more consistent. And it makes more sense to then approach galleries at that point rather than when you're in your kind of teenage years of making, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think, you know, you're um that is one. So it's kind of like when I sometimes like get in front of students that are getting a little bit too, well, I'm not painting on an oil ground that was made under a harvest moon by the hands of a, you know, like, you know, these like really esoteric technical concerns. And I'm like, do you want your student work surviving? And you know, I didn't. So it is a little bit like, you know, you want to make sure that you're kind of putting in your kind of uh everything's proportional, you know, to its, you know, kind of proportionally related, I guess, when it comes to that.
Yeah.
But I think it's also a really good point in terms of um how much, like, I think it brings up a really good point too, like when it's a really hard question to answer in terms of like the selling, how do I price and all this stuff, because there are so many variables that are also very personal that come into it, like you were saying, like just one's financial situation, where they live, things like that you kind of don't think about, because we think of painting as either a completely romantic thing, or as purely craft, but you know, one or the other. But I think so. I think those are all really really good points. I think also, you know, like I was saying too, it's like, and this is where I could be very wrong, but you know, it really doesn't seem like galleries are as much of an essential as they once were, just with all the avenues that you have an ability to have a direct connection to an audience, or a following, or whatever the proper term is that like you kind of don't need the facilitation of that through a gallery anymore. I mean, it helps, but no.
I
Sorry,
do
Cindy.
think like group shows is a good place to do some fact finding and to learn about, you know, where your work's sitting in a certain community or whatever. So you can enter some. Well, first of all, you can go to some, see what people are charging for like the similar size and, let's say, effort level of what you're doing, where you feel like your artwork fits in, enter some shows, see what the response is, see if you get in. You can enter some of these like national things like Richeson's, some of their contests and that sort of thing. And like you just have to, you have to look around. You got to figure out where you fit in now, and then know that as you get better, your prices will go up. You'll get into better shows and all that. So you have to start small.
Yeah, a lot of it is a little bit kind of like with Lauren's question, is like just keep, like it's almost like just keep like paint first, and then like just keep doing that, and the other things kind of follow. It's like Warhol had this great, of all people, had this one saying that I really like, where he was saying, you know, make what you think is art, and while everybody's debating on whether it's good or not, or if it is art, just do another thing, and then repeat, repeat, repeat. And it's very true. It's very simple, but I think that there's truth in that. I think especially also, you know, when it comes down to you know, especially the way that paintings and just you know, art is somewhat commercialized today, is that you're really investing in the story of the person who's doing it. So there's a certain kind of a certain self-advertise, like you're really putting yourself out there quite literally. And I think that, without, again, having like those direct veins of access can be really helpful to know, just to know what your, depending on what your audience is, but it doesn't have to be I guess the small percentage or 1% people that kind of go to galleries. Although John Waters has a great line about the one. He goes, "I don't know why artists yell about the 1%. Who do you think buys paintings? You better shut up about them," because like that's kind of true, actually. But I also think that I think that a lot of where there's the two other places where I see a lot of people with representational training making a lot of for financial, in terms of financial success. There's a lot of tattoo artists that go back and forth in an atelier world. Like there's a lot of crossover there, and there's a lot of like illustration Comic-Con kind of people. If that's Comic-Con people, that's a good term there. So Thomas has a question. If you can paint the way you want, hold on. If you can paint what you want the way you want, then when there becomes some demand for it, you will be able to continue to paint what you want and the way you want to work. Right. So I think what Thomas is saying here is, again, kind of like, basically, if it's almost like that, if you build it, they will come, kind of saying, essentially, where it's like that, if you kind of again, kind of knowing yourself and define exactly what your, I guess, what your brand is, if you want to call it that way, that basically by consistently stating that, eventually, things do come through there. But again, that kind of goes back to the whole conversation of kind of finding out who you are and stuff, which is a really difficult, kind of difficult process. But that's where I find art history to be really valuable, because you kind of find like what I like and what I don't like. And I really like going through museums and not looking at the big names and trying to find, like I tend to try to kind of like find the gems that I don't know of yet, or the painters that I haven't heard of yet. Because I find that sometimes when you're looking at a very well-known painter, sometimes it's the fact that it's a Rembrandt, or the fact that it's a Caravaggio or a Titian. Sometimes that the name is really hard to get away from. And so when you're looking at it, it's hard to be objective about your response to it, because you're just so aware of the fact that it's a Vermeer. So but if it's almost an unknown artist, you're kind of, your defenses are down, you don't have any preconceptions, and you're kind of more open to an experience that way. But yeah.
Do you mind if I jump in and
Yeah,
say one more thing?
Yeah.
I'd also say, I think there's an illusion, and I know because I thought this myself when I was, again, doing $50 paintings on Etsy and following my favorite artists on their blogs or whatever, is I think there's an unfair illusion that we assume that painters who all they do is paint are making a full living out of it. And I think you'd really be surprised at the number of artists that are able to only paint and only do create paintings and sell for a living. A lot of times there's other financial things happening in the background that you are unaware of. And so the people who are, so again, Natalie Featherston she is a hustler. She works her ass off, and she is so passionate about what she does. So it does require 100% of yourself putting energy in day to day to day to day, no matter what. But the vast majority of people who it seems maybe only paint, and they have this kind of, again, romantic idea, there are other things in the wings that are allowing them the freedom to do that. For me personally, I need to balance reliable income and making art that really drives me, and there's people who do only, actually Thomas is an amazing portrait painter, and he has really put effort into building his client relationship so they are able to bring in referrals. So again, it's like you got to have a business mindset of how do I grow and maintain these relationships of the people buying my work. So, you know, there's a lot more than just making good stuff going on here.
Right. Yeah. And you know, there is always like it's, and actually, you know, like I'm doing research for my art history lecture in September on uh, female painters, where there is a lot of there's an essay by, and I bring this up a lot in the lecture, by Linda Nochlin, called "Why Are There No Great Women Artists?" And in the essay, she talks about how to be termed an artist, you really had to have a set of social criteria, and one of it's, you know, and one of them is that you had to have a certain financial backing. And so, like, you know, I mean, it's the example that comes to mind right away is just like, you know, so Van Gogh had his brother. You know, Lucian Freud had his family's wealth so that he really, you know, he could really devote himself to his practice. And it was what's really, and the reason I bring up the art history thing is that one of the first successful female painters, Lavinia, she her father luckily knew how to market her so that she could be a successful painter on her own, because he saw in his daughter a very talented painter, but knew she could not do it because of the fact that she was born a woman, and so managed to kind of manipulate the market in order for her to be successful. And the way he did that was he made her very well educated, so she had an acquaintance with the world and could respect all customs and tradition. You know, she's very well educated. She sold for very little money, so she was cheaper than other offers, and she was just a perfectly devout, pleasant kind of young Christian woman at the time. So like she kind of filled all these boxes, but because she was well educated and she kind of cornered her father helped to corner the market a little bit by making her charge very little, but her quality was very high. People, well, I'm going to work with, you know, with her. So that's kind of what established her career, really. So there are those kind of I'll call them unromantic kind of elements that really are key factors, though, to those you know, to those things. And that's where, again, it's very individual, like, just because to some people that idea of painting for, you know, like 8 hours a day sounds like the dream job, and for other people that sounds like real, like that's tough. But,
Yeah,
you know,
that
that's
sort of
where,
brings us full circle to what we were talking about earlier, which is you got to know
yeah,
yourself, and you got to
yeah,
know what you're willing to do. And it's not unlike
hmm
any other business that you're in. Like, your effort directly affects your results
hmm yeah,
in this
and
whimsical art world, really.
yeah, yeah, and you know, it is you know, and I think yeah, especially, and I'm not even talking about the whole AI controversy, because I have a friend who has a doctorate in AI, ethical AI, so, excuse me, and he was doing he was asking me questions about
Do they give doctorates in unethical AI?
well, I made that joke too. I was like, so is there unethical AI? But apparently, so like the way he said that it's like it's the study of AI, developing it like ethically with like all these as opposed to just the pursuit of its advancement or something. But he was asking me because he came up with this well, show, if you want, about AI art pieces and stuff, and I kind of just leaned into it because I just didn't know I felt really bad because it was a little bit of I would put my foot in my mouth kind of thing, because I was like, well, I don't think it qualifies, because I was really going into how I really just vehemently disagree and dislike and totally and just was railing against this whole AI tirade. And then he was just kind of going on about how its practical uses and stuff like that. And I'm like, I did have somebody like kind of saying it's good for helping to generate kind of like compositional ideas. I'm like, but that's part of the painting process, is this conjuring, this formulation of the idea. But anyway, that's a whole another controversial topic, and I don't fully understand it, let alone to have a really informed opinion on it. So Dale, you say here, kind of like Sargent, he didn't necessarily enjoy painting portraits, or more accurately, didn't enjoy entertaining the sitter client, but became known for them. Yeah, that is true about Sargent. Sargent apparently really did not like doing portraits. His favorite thing to do were landscape watercolors. That was his time where he was the most relaxed and really truly kind of enjoying himself painting, or at least that's what we're told. You know, I think you know, there's a lot of I think Sargent's really kind of interesting, just because the more I read about him, there's just certain things about him that kind of feels somewhat very modern about just some of his approaches to things too. But Sargent, yeah, actually apparently did not really enjoy doing portraits, but especially did not like intermingling with some of the aristocracy, because he just didn't really get along very well. But he apparently didn't have a great career. At first, his career did not do very well, especially after the whole Madame X issue. After that was exhibited, he came to London and did a few portraits, and they were just not met with a lot of praise until he did. I always forget the name of the painting of the two young girls lighting lanterns. I always forget. It's on every like tin that cookies are in, of like these two girls lighting lanterns at dusk.
Carnation Lily Rose.
Yes, thank you. I was like, it's more like a sentence than a single word. So that painting, which you know, he basically worked on for months. We're only being able to work on it for like, I think 30 minutes a day, because he had it was this like dusk hour that he had to set up. That was this painting that really kind of cemented his career back in London after he moved back from Paris. But you know, so that's kind of another example of kind of how like sometimes finances kind of really affect some successful outcomes, because Sargent really had it was a bit of like the perfect storm of circumstances to create such a great painter. I think that, you know, his first of all, he was incredibly, I mean, born with a gift, really, but his mother really you know, dragged them across, you know, him and his siblings, you know, all throughout Europe. His father was a medical illustrator as well, among other things, and really kind of tasked Sargent when he, you know, in his studies of drawing, would task him with drawing very abbreviated versions of what he saw very quickly. But because his parents were well off, they could afford traveling through Europe, and so he had this childhood of going to museums and having this kind of guidance from his father, but also kind of, again, this with this like strong financial support. So you know, Sargent was also really benefited from his upbringing as well. But it also just makes me feel a little bit better just knowing that, because when you see how good he is, sometimes it just helps to know, okay, well, you know, he had these, you know, silver spoon kind of thing. But yeah, Sargent is I really like when the letters of I always talk about the letters that Madame Gautreau, who is the subject of Madame X, she goes to Venice with Sargent, and where he does these incredible watercolors of like the ones in Venice. I think it's interesting because, like, I think Turner's best watercolors are when he's in Venice, and I think Sargent's watercolors are best when they're in Venice. And you know, Durer does some of his best work in Venice.
Everybody go to Venice.
Yeah, everybody go to Venice before before it sinks. But Madame Gautreau, she writes to her friend back in Paris, and she's like, she's just like, well, she goes, I'm surprised that John can do as many paintings as he's done, considering he spends so much of his time with the Gondola Boys. And I read that and I was just like in stitches for like 10 minutes. I was like just laughing hysterically because his long-term boyfriend was Italian, I believe. I can't remember his name, but he was a really good look. He's in the show too. There's a couple of unfinished pieces of him. But I actually remember Fernando was the one who told me about the well, I should say the suspicions about Sargent. And I was like, oh, really? And then he showed me his early watercolors, and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, yeah. Just very overtly, like there's just a lot of, like male nudes with like their arms like this and like their legs kind of apart. It's like very, very overt. But yeah, go to Venice. I think that's also really apparently that's the only place in Europe at that time where you could actually get blue paper. And so when Dürer was there, he bought up all the blue paper that was there, but it became part of his trademark. This kind of goes back to the whole branding marketing thing. Dürer is a great person to study for that because he's really the first, like, he really was the first modern artist where he kind of makes himself like, oh no, people are buying me, kind of a thing. And his anagram, the AD, was very important, but the blue paper was a Dürer signature. So when he ran out of this paper, obviously it would have been a trek to go back to Venice, but he just ends up dyeing the paper or painting paper blue. So that's one way that they can actually date if a Dürer drawing is before or of a certain time period, if it's genuinely from Venice or if it's post Venice, it's painted, kind of a thing.
So BV and AV, before Venice and after Venice.
Yeah, exactly. And but Dürer also is really influenced by the Venetians too. Like he does a couple, he does one work specifically that's almost a ripoff of well, I should say heavily influenced by oh shoot, Giovanni Bellini, I think Bellini.
I love Bellini.
I love Bellini too. I think he's very underappreciated, Bellini. I think a lot of Venetians are in general for some reason, but I was brushing up on the book what's that really big one by oh damn, the oil and not the speed book, the British one that's like really thick from it's like traditional application of the it was written by the first curator of the British Museum. Oh shoot. Anyway, he talks about Venetian painting in his book as he calls it effeminate painting in his book, which I thought was a really strange title. What's that book called? Sorry, I just want to research this really quick. It's the
I was just trying to find it.
Oil painting. Oh, this is really ticking me off because I was literally just looking at it. British curator. I'm going to look at it, and it's going to be.
Is it traditional oil painting?
Yes, I think that's it. I think it is.
Virgil Elliot?
Oh no, not Elliot. Not Elliot. Oh, but that's helped it a little bit. Eastlake. Robert Eastlake. Oh, yeah. So Robert Eastlake was the first curator of the National Gallery in London. So he talks about the differences between Venetian painting and Flemish painting, and he says that he goes on to summarize Venetian methods being a series of glazing, scumbling, and for some reason, I can't remember it, he calls it effeminate, whereas Flemish has a strong, more masculine layering. He uses very strange, like terminology that just would not fly today. Essentially, he's the one that, remember, we were deciphering what he meant when he said that you should start with the carnations of the flesh.
Yeah.
we were like, what does that mean? And it's the red, because carnations are like, so you should start with the reds of the skin, essentially. But it's written in that very flowery,
Is that
almost
a
like,
big book though? I don't remember that being
well,
that big.
it's 2 volumes. So I have one where it's compounded into one big book, but it is
Okay.
it
Yeah.
technically is 2 volumes.
I only have one
Um,
volume then.
yeah, it's he really likes a few specific artists that he really talks about. He when that book was written, the National Gallery had just acquired the Arnolfini marriage by Van Eyck, and Van Eyck was at that time was being accredited to inventing oil painting, which is not true. And he actually was going to refute that, but the book was being published before by the time that he had ambitions to do that. But it is a very good read for art historical knowledge, for technical knowledge. But it is a read. Like it's Call Me Ishmael is pretty much how it starts. It's like he basically starts the history of oil painting with German monks in the 13th century. Like that's how the book begins. So just it's in a very flowery language. It's a slug to get through, but it is fascinating. But it is a bit of it's not a light read. I'll just say that. I actually really like I like Solomon's book a lot. Solomon J. Solomon's book. I like his a lot on painting. I think his is pretty good because his is also like I like Speed a lot, of course, but I think Solomon is a little bit more like you're talking with a painter in a painter's studio about how to do things, whereas Speed is definitely almost like lecturing to you a little bit.
That just
But
made
yeah,
me think of the book. My Name is Asher Lev. Have you ever read that book?
it's funny you bring that up. Somebody else was mentioning. Oh
I
no,
love
no, no, no.
that
That oh I
the work of
somebody
fiction.
didn't. It is a work of fiction, and it's about. Is it about a Jewish boy?
Hasidic Jewish artist. Yeah, it's good.
I think oh, I know why. For some reason I saw I think Bo Bartlett did a paint. I think he did a painting based on that book or something, and it was
Oh, did
popped
he?
up. I think so, and yeah, I saw it I was reading a blurb about it, and it mentioned My Name is Asher Lev, and I had heard about it a few years ago, but I have not read it actually.
You're going to the beach. Take it with you.
That one's good. Yeah. Well, I remember when we I remember with Robert Henry's The Art Spirit. I always think of what Nelson Shanks said about it, where he's like, "Oh, it's got some good stuff in there. Once you sift past the bullshit." Pardon my French.
I enjoyed that one as well.
Yeah, I think I get what he's saying. Like it's
Yeah.
it's very unsystematic. It's like it's kind of very like he rambles in the book. Like it's not like
Yeah, it's not
there's
great literature. It's just interesting. Like,
it's like it's a very much the book you could just pick up, open, and read wherever you are, and it's
yeah.
kind of like it's a very self-contained episodes, kind of a thing. Whereas like Eastlake is not that. Like it's like, what are you talking about? Where are we? What's going on? Kind of a thing.
It's like the read and reread. Go back a few pages. Read it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I yes, and I feel so ignorant sometimes because I'll be doing that. I do that so often, especially with like authors that I love, like Simon Schama. Love Simon Schama, but I do find sometimes like read a full page and then I'll be like, nope, let's do it again.
I know. I come back to him every once in a while because I know you do really love him, but
I love him. Yeah, I love
it
him.
can be. I haven't delved
He,
into it as strongly as you have.
so he said, well, I was teaching a private student who knew him and privately, and I like was probably bothering her with so many questions about him, but she said he was, incredibly nice and very loves to shop. But he's very wordy, and in an interview once he said that when he was in university, that was always the note given to him by professors: a bit wordy, Mr. Sharma, too wordy, too wordy. but he paints with words essentially. But I just think he's so great about giving you the context in which paintings were made, because I think that, you know, when you're looking at a painting in a hushed museum, it's really radically outside of the conditions it was painted in, and oftentimes where it was meant to be viewed. And I think that also
I always had this fantasy that if you could like be listening to music and smelling the smells and knowing like the historical context politically and all that at the same time as looking at the painting, how awesome would that be?
yeah. Well, just before I logged on, I was looking at this video that there's these two paintings by Caravaggio that were painted for the Monte brothers. So the Supper at Emmaus, that's in the National Gallery in London, and Judas betraying Christ, and it's their first time that they're being reunited in quite some time. And I was really jealous because the curator of the show was saying that the two paintings are in a room with a very high north light facing window, so probably very similar to the way that Caravaggio painted it. And she was saying that they were able to turn the lights off, so they were able to see the paintings illuminated by natural light only. And I was just like, oh my god, that must
be amazing.
She said what was interesting is she goes, it looked way more dimensional, like in real life. Like,
Oh.
I mean, with only natural light, she goes, it was incredible how much more dimensional it looked. And I'm like, I'm sure it must have been incredible. Let's see here. So I've got a couple comments here, and so Thomas here is just commenting on Sargent's training, which we were talking about really briefly, saying that, you know, Sargent really worked his butt off as a student. He did, and his student works alone are really incredible. He's one of those people that just got painting early and he just understood it. You know, some people like Rembrandt, for example, really comes into his own and really masters it later in life. You know, Titian, you could argue the same thing, but it's Sargent really, like, is just one of those freaks of nature that just kind of gets it right away, and he's really one of the few that is like that. So he says he would leave Duran's studio and go to another studio to paint in another class at the Beaux-Arts. I have also seen this. His drawings of the Swiss Alps at 13. I've definitely seen those landscape watercolor paintings. Some of them might be in gouache, I can't remember, of the Alps, and just his travels as a young teenager, and even at a young teenager, they're absolutely incredible. You really get a sense of atmosphere, space, and and his sister actually was actually very gifted, a very gifted artist as well. Sargent apparently also would use some of his student works as well. I don't know, this sounds a bit more like an apocryphal story than a legitimate story. Like, it sounds a little Vasari-esque, but Sargent apparently, I read once, would use some of his student works as rags to clean his brushes for, you know, later down the road. And again, that seems like a bit of an apocryphal story, but his student work is really incredible. But you can really see the in his painting of his portrait of Carlos Duran, you can see that he's already kind of surpassed Duran in a lot of, not only just his abilities, but just in his composition and things like that. That's another question I did in the beginning. What was it? So, sorry. So, Myra, I'm seeing your question here. I've seen that your method is very useful for portraying things that are in front of you, but I find it pretty difficult when I have to paint from imagination and think of light effects, colors, perspective, etc. Is there a way to train this other way of painting, like building a scene from zero? Is there a method of the Academy, the way to build a visual library? I've heard there are some books about this out there, like James Gurney's, but I would like to know which ones you recommend. So yeah, so Right, drawing and painting from imagination, it's just incredibly difficult. I think that's a whole other discipline that I really am in awe of when people can do that, very well. There is actually a book about drawing from memory that I have by shoot. Oh, it starts with an H-H-O. I think it is just called. I think the title of it is called just Memory Training for Artists or something. To words to that effect. The last name of the artist, I think, is Horace. I think it is spelled Hoarce. I'm the world's worst speller. It's not my native tongue, so there's a couple barriers there. So I appreciate it. I apologize if that's off. But there is a book on memory training, and he does go through exercises and ways that you can train yourself to draw from memory. And from what it's been some time since I've referred to this book, but from what I remember, he actually is very articulate in outlining the things that you should do. And it involves, as you might expect, a lot of staring and a lot of really drawing in your mind. And it's a little bit like training at the gym. If I remember correctly, he talks about doing it in spurts, like looking at something for a long time and then, turning it over and then drawing it from memory and then seeing how you did and then doing it for less time and less time and less time.
Horace Lecoq de Bois Baudran.
That's what I said. But that's it. Yes.
You remember we did that in figure drawing class at one point. You remember when Liz was around and we were doing like the proportions of the foot, and then they'd try and replicate it from memory after. It was great.
Yeah. Well, and I remember
We do it a lot.
Well, you have to do it a lot. And one thing I remember Emmy telling me at the Florence Academy was that there was one figure session where they made everybody do a gesture from memory. And she said that the gestures from memory were better than the ones they did from the ones that were in front. And I said, I guarantee it, because when you're in front, it's just the fear of being disloyal to what's in front of you is stronger than just your kind of feeling that gesture. So that book for memory drawing, I is one book just based on some of the things you're saying, Myra, would be one recommendation. When it comes to also doing things that are conceptual or that require a bit more of an inventiveness, the other two people who I might point you to historically would be Nikolai Poussin and Messonnier. I'm forgetting Messonnier's first name, but his last name is Messonnier. The reason I bring those two up is because they were people who definitely painted outside of what they were able to paint, of what's like they had paintings where their imagination was bigger than what their studio could contain. And so they had to find out methods and ways that they would accomplish that. And both of them went through very extraordinary but feasible lengths to create mock setups as models for their still lifes. Poussin especially, and actually, if you look him up, the Louvre actually has recreated some of his models. He actually created about 6 inches tall little wax figures that he sculpted through careful observation of classical antiquity, and then from there would then be able to position them. He put them in a box with a small window so that he could actually control the lighting, and had a perspective grid on the floor. So he basically created a maquette for himself and then created a little world and would translate that to something full size. Messonnier did a very similar thing. Messonnier, though, kind of, again, this kind of going back to kind of Julie's point, he had some serious financial backing. So he once had a painting sell for basically the equivalent of an estate. Like it basically was the equivalent of a mansion. He was a very wealthy painter, but he was depicting, I think it was, he was doing the 5 battles of Napoleon, or the 5 great battles of Napoleon. He only did 2, I think, but while he was painting one, he actually hired a rancher to bring these horses over to this field that he owned and trot all over the ground so he could get the feeling of war horse trotted land for this painting. So it really felt like a battle had been waged on the ground. He would dump flour over the models to make it look like snow for his scene of Napoleon. It's actually flour kind of that he's dumping on people to make it seem like they're snow covered.
There was also a female artist, British, who did that as well. I think her last name was Butler. I can't remember her first name, but same sort of thing. Exactly.
Butler?
She's got paintings in the Queen's collection.
Oh yeah, well, Butler the name rings a bell. So that's like, those are some examples of artists that they definitely had a bigger imagination again than what their studio could hold. So they did actually have to, and their strong suit wasn't working from imagination. So they actually needed something in front of them. And that was the way that they kind of got around those elements.
Antigone did that as well. So I remember reading an artist magazine. It was an old one. I think it was like from the 60s or something like that. But I don't know if you remember that. I think it's called The Beggar or something. It's a single figure, an old man, he's wearing like a gray outfit or whatever. And they showed the maquette that he built for that. And it was just small and he had it lit or whatever. And a great painting.
Yeah, no, and it doesn't, like, they don't have, I mean, of course you could be like Jericho and do the whole like raft of the Medusa and actually build the raft and actually kind of do all that. But most of the time they are much smaller and they're just kind of then scaled up larger. So I think that for me anyway, and especially like Rembrandt, same thing. I think that this is also where sometimes technology can be very helpful. So like there are, with today's, you're able to take multiple photos, put them together, and actually kind of almost create a digital mock-up of what you want your painting to look like, and then just paint that.
Don't you think one of the things that you see often is you can tell people have done that? So like, I think you got to look at like somebody like Correggio or somebody like that and just really see how everything is so atmospheric and lit by seemingly one light. Like you just know that he was able to do that and it wasn't sitting there in front of him. And it's just like you can do that piecemeal stuff, but I think you have to unify it. You got that's the secret, like soft edges.
Yeah, the unification is really tricky. And I think that that's also where that comes down to light source, I think too. I think that making sure that, so light has such a really rich relationship with art. It's seen as like art's accomplice. Light is always like, it illuminates form, all this stuff. So with lighting, sorry, my handsome husband distracted me for a second there. With lighting, I remember Fernando told me Tiepolo is a really good artist to look at for unification, because Tiepolo uses in his compositions, Fernando, I remember always telling me Tiepolo is a master of negative spaces. He could make negative spaces feel empty but necessary, and was great at like combining different things. If you look at Tiepolo's preparatory work, they're the closest thing you'll see to planar figures you see today, like boxes for heads and boxes for chests, and the mannequins you see like Tiepolo does. It's almost like they look like they were done today. They start out very plainer, very simple, and they work up in complexity from just ink washes, blocky figures to then a fully formed piece. I was going to say that Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo are also very much in the same, but they're not in the same caliber because for two reasons. One, Michelangelo, a lot of it's out of his head. But secondly, the three of them, with the exception of Leonardo, they don't fit the term of what we would say a realist is, because their understandings of art was to elevate reality to, it's a revival of classical formulas as an effort to achieve the divine. So their ambitions of painting was not to hold a mirror up to the world, which is more of a contemporary representational thing. So, but they worked very much out of their heads. I think that's because of their ambitions. They didn't have to be I mean, who can say a bad thing about Michelangelo? But if I told you that the Sistine Chapel was a photograph, you wouldn't believe me. So there's a difference there. Yeah. So for anybody who's interested, Julie posted in the general chat the title of the book that I was mentioning about memory training, and the author's very lengthy last name. One of my favorite speaking of drawing from memory or painting from memory, is Frank Frazetta. I adore Frank Frazetta. I love a lot of illustrators. I think illustrators don't get the artistic credit that they deserve. They're just think of just merely illustrators. Thomas here, memory drawing and drawing from one's imagination are two different things. That is true. To memorize and imagine means that you can recreate the image. If you know the principle of perspective and how it affects the shape and visual impression of form, and the principles of light and shade, you can construct forms you imagine different positions and under different lighting circumstances. That is much different from drawing or painting something once it's been memorized, right? Memory drawing is mostly beneficial if you stop and think about what you were doing and ask why, so you learn about the principles of perspective and light, right? So I think that for me, when it comes to working from memory or working from your imagination, if you're drawing like a dragon or some kind of fictional thing, you obviously don't have a memory of seeing it, but the memory training is really if you're painting or drawing representationally, and let's say you're having however you want to draw something somewhat fantastical, where you have let's say classically angels coming in from the sky and things like that. It has to be grounded in the language of nature for it to feel like it's a part of the same painting. And so memorizing the effects of light on form, benign of any particular effects, let's say on glass but just how light behaves on form in general, will then be the costume in which your imagination then has to wear in order to be represented. And so I think that also comes down to what I think how some people work. I love the illustrator John Howe, who did a lot of the concept work for Lord of the Rings, and he described as his drawing process as just shutting his brain off and allowing his imagination and intuition to take over. I tend to be just more of the person. I'm just not that good. I need a model in order to reference and then to reflect. But I do think that Thomas brings up a really good point, that there's a difference between, it's a complicated relationship between drawing from your imagination versus drawing from memory. And I think that memory maybe helps formulate your imagination a little bit more. But as with a lot of the things we were saying prior, I think practice is really key. Yeah, I think also that's where I think in terms of where you're resourcing your information can also really help. I think that type of information, I think also would really be so I would be looking in a lot of references for illustration for illustrators and things like that, because I do think that that would so there might be more kind of ready available techniques and methods kind of in those forums for those things.
It might be easier to start with something a little less complicated than the human figure too. So I've been doing a little bit of study of birds. Like first I studied their anatomy, then I started trying to understand like their feather structure. And I haven't done too many, but I've done a couple of they're not imaginative. They're a bird that I want to fit into a certain space. And so I'm trying to turn it and tip it and make it look. And it's not naturalistic, but it certainly is believable enough. Like I'm not trying to make it look like it's a photographic representation of a bird. So start small, maybe.
Yeah, I think
Because the human figure, that's a pretty ambitious place to start with.
well, it's
Imaginative.
yeah, that's my problem always whenever I'm whenever I'm kind of starting anything like that. I always want to start, well, we start at the top. It's like, well, that's where I want to get to, so we just start with, like, well, how about we start with baby steps before we sign up for a marathon, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And that's always, so I think that's always a really, regardless of what the task is, like always starting with like, well, let's start simple first is always really helpful. So I think even if it's just simple forms that are lit from the left side, simple forms that are lit from the right side, and just trying to draw those without any outside reference, but from just memorizing how, well, again, imagining, I guess, how light would be behaving on the said object as if it were in front of you. But it is not easy, and again, it's a skill set that I really admire in artists that can do that really really well. It's really, I have a couple friends who really could do that. I'm always there's a few things I always get very envious about, because when people do them really well, when people have very good drafting skills, I am super envious. Where like Fernando is like that, my friend Will is like that, with very little time and what appears to be very little effort. It's like, that's them. Like I can just tell right away. So I'm very envious of that. And I'm always very envious when people can draw very well, just like from their imagination. To me, that's a magic trick. It's like, to me, that's like sorcery.
And aren't you imagining that they're drawing all the time? So I remember one of the
Yeah.
class that I went to grad school with. I mean, he was always looking down into his sketchbook. Like, I don't even know how it had any relationships, because he was always drawing in his sketchbook, and he could do it. He could draw imaginative things in his sketchbook, but he did it all the time.
Yeah. Well, and this is where, again, there's a, I don't want to misnationalize them. There was I know an Asian artist who passed away suddenly of a heart attack not too long ago, who was very famous for doing a lot of very complicated drawings out of his head. I can't remember his name. And very, very well known, and did incredibly detailed, with fisheye perspective. Yes, thank you, Hannah. Kim Jong-ji, I think, and he did these amazing, incredibly complicated drawings with no references. And I'm paraphrasing, but in interviews, when asked about how he attained that ability, again, it was just basically what you just said. I draw all the time, or I drew as a kid, everything I looked at from every angle. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but he made it seem like basically when you draw so much from everything, there's just this huge vault of memory that it all goes into. And when you're thinking, okay, what would a bowl look like? Well, I think I did draw one from this perspective once, and it kind of looked like this. So let me start with that. And it just like that muscle memory kind of helps to manifest the imagination there. But that's always really, really. Will did that all the time, and I think Stephen Assell was one of his teachers at SVA, School of Visual Arts in New York, and he really was adamant about all of his students keeping sketchbook. And so for as long as I've known Will, he's always kept a sketchbook and has always drawn in it. And even people on the subway, he really would get incredible likenesses. I have one of his sketches that he did of me, and it's really impressive. Yeah, it's really pissed me off, actually. He would piss me off when I working next to him. He'd piss me off a lot.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because we understood things, like he was really great with construction, but when it came to modeling and subtle effects of light, to me that felt very natural, but he was really puzzled by that. And I remember Fernando really having to work with him, like with just form modeling and just like not being so general and being a bit more articulate. So like we understood things differently, but grass is always greener. I always thought his was much more valuable. Um, uh, Thomas here is also just chiming in. Storyboard artists need that skill because they are where it starts. There is no reference that comes from them. Yeah, exactly. And I think actually too, I think that when people are looking, I think that's one of the things that makes older films superior, is that they were thinking far more visually, especially in black and white, because you only thought they only had value. So I do think that there's a certain visual resonance there. Like that's why Hitchcock notoriously the Hitchcock blonde is not because he had well, maybe he did have a thing for blonde, but because the blonde showed up on a black and white screen. So the black here would get lost in the dark of a background. So that's why the Hitchcock blonde was born. But Myra here is asking, what do you think of Harold Speed's words about a current artistic constipation? Well, it's been some time since I've read that. I'm always re-referencing all of his really technical stuff. But he does. I remember the broad strokes of his artistic philosophy, and I from what I remember about the term artistic constipation, I think I remember him saying, words to the effect of, a lot of people kind of do kind of extravagant work that they don't mean, as a way of banging a loud drum to get people's attention, and then they kind of go on with what they really intend to in painting. I'd have to refresh exactly what he means by that term. Let me see. So here, quick means of transit and cheap methods of reproduction have brought the art of the world to outdoors, where formerly the artistic food at the disposal of the student was restricted to the few pictures in his vicinity and some of the prints of others. Now there is scarcely a picture of note in the world that is not known to the average student. Well, yeah, I guess that would be double so now in a digital age, where you have so much available at your disposal and there's so much saturation, where like it's really hard to explain. Like like people saw paintings from like lithographs that other people drew of paintings. So they the way that Rembrandt knew of some paintings like that Leonardo did was not by seeing them, but was by seeing lithographs that people did of paintings, let alone to know of esoteric gems that that we know now of certain painters. And I think that that's a really unique problem that we have. I think so. In Speed's time, it was just beginning with the whole industrial revolution. And then now, yeah, I think that there's a certain kind of I don't know. It's almost an overwhelm. Like to me, it seems overwhelming, where there's just like this oversaturation. And I think like on Instagram and everything, you'll see artists posting these like scribbles, that the work I did for the day, and it's like, who are you showing this to, and like what refrigerator do you think I'm going to put this up on? It's like I sometimes like just the capitalistic kind of turnover rate. It's like, well, I need to show like this kind of production kind of thing that I just don't always like agree with, I guess. but let me just reread here, where formerly the artistic food at the disposal that was restricted to a few pictures in his vicinity, right? That's the other thing too, is that painters of the past would have to go, and this gets back to my earlier point about going to museums and looking at paintings, is that if you are looking to be an oil painter, you do need to see oil paintings in person to see how the glazes are put, like how is the image constructed. And I think I think today it's fantastic that you can look at these high res digital scans of paintings. And I actually recently saw this scan of the girl with the pearl earring, where you're able to zoom in and see the surface of the landscape, and it looks like a landscape, hills and valley, like it is so zoomed in. And that is so valuable. But I think in while it is valuable in one respect, it's also maybe given reason, excuse to actually not make the pilgrimage to actually see the actual piece, which is still, no matter what, the highest res scan is still always second rate to actually seeing the image itself. It's just, that's just the way it is. And actually, Cindy told me that, you told me that about the girl with the pearl earring. Actually, funnily enough, is that I think you were saying, even like I think I was showing you a really high res scan for like a workshop or something, and you were saying that's actually really a high res, but it still doesn't even come close to seeing her in person.
Yeah. Any Vermeer. Amazing.
Yeah, that's kind of that's always been my thing against the whole Tim's Vermeer crowd, is like he used the camera obscura. It's like, well, even if he did, he knew how to use it better than anybody else, because even when I'm in a room with other of his contemporaries, I still just like make a beeline for the Vermeers. He just, you know,
I
is
also
always
think like there's something to be said for seeing the context of the actual size of the thing. So you can
Yes.
say Vermeer in two different ways. You can see some large paintings, how beautiful they are, well handled. And then you can see the little Arnolfini that's so small, and there's so much stuff in there, but it's not like overdone, and it's not photographic, and it's not sharp edges everywhere. It's just like,
Yeah, it's
you need both.
You do, and it's you know, and it's like so like Rembrandt's The Jewish Bride and the Arnolfini Marriage, you could almost say, are great compare and contrast, because they're both really beautifully sensitive paintings, but done in very different, sensitive is defined very differently in those two paintings. But they're equal, but but they're just really different. I think that's really one. I mean, that I remember about seeing that room of Vermeers at the National Galleries, walking into, well, not Vermeers, but of that era. And I just remember like going in, and the first thing my eye saw was the woman at the Virginal that they have, and the first thing I went to, and it was the thing I spent the most time in front of. Like, it's just really, really, really incredible.
Makes you hungry, doesn't it, to get into a museum?
It's you know, Vermeer, like any of the good painters, it's kind of like you have this, like it's like the stages of grief that you go through in a way. It's like the stages of it's stages of inspiration. You're like, oh my god, that's incredible, and then you just like, you bastard. It just like it's a lot of emotions that hit you.
Well, I have to say, I did a copy of The Girl with the Pearl Earring, and I've seen some really bad ones, and I think mine is pretty good, and I feel very satisfied looking at that copy. I know it's just a copy, but I'm like,
yeah,
I did a pretty good job.
Well, I love looking at copies of old, like I loved looking at Rubens copies of Caravaggio, because to me it's like when Aretha Franklin does cover songs of Adele. It's kind of just like, it's like a great painter doing a cover song of another. So and he changes, like he actually does a copy of a Caravaggio and a Titian. They're both depositions, and he kind of puts them together in one composition. And it's so we have such a fear when we're doing a copy that, oh, it doesn't look exactly like the thing. I've messed up. Meanwhile, Rubens is actively dissecting and introducing figures and changing gestures.
He was a genius at that.
Yeah, he really was. And then you have Sargent's copy of Velasquez's. They look like Sargent more than they look like that's more Sargent than Velasquez. So it's like I really love looking, because it kind of again goes to show you the reason you copy is to understand the choices, the mindset. It's not to make a forgery, essentially.
The I can't remember what museum I was in, but they had probably 8 or 9 Rubens color studies, and they were about, I don't know, 11 by 14, 12 by 18, something like that. So great to like, because he's so big,
Yeah.
just see like what he could do with this color study in that small little size. And they were awesome. And they weren't finished. They were just color studies. They were
see, like that's the stuff to us. They're like we like them better than the paintings for some
and
reason.
they
Like
would throw them away.
Yeah. It's the same with like Rockwell's like that. There's a few studies that Rockwell did for paintings that I'm like, I like the study way more than the finished piece. I think it's got more emotional strength technically. It's just like there's a lot more. That happens a lot.
That's why we all need to like lose our photographic tendencies, like to analyze the world photographically, because
well, I think that's one thing one of the last things I want to say is like that's actually kind of a really, I think that's very demonstrative of so like when people want to pay you a compliment about your painting,
I hate this.
It looks like a photograph, because and that what's telling to me about that is that in a modern society, a photo is more real than real. So like the synthetic image is more real to me than the object itself. So my measure of success is that looks like a photograph. And I think that most representational painters, and this is what Freud was going after, is the surreal, but in the original definition, not the Dali, where it's realer than the thing itself. Like that's what the strive is for. I think that I think that that's and I think that in a way that's kind of what Pollock was after was like to make no lies about the fact that this is just paint on a flat surface and how that's purely an optical experience. It's very radical and a little one note, but it is in one way it's extremely realistic. But oh yes, and Thomas does also bring up Sargent's version of Las Meninas is much smaller. Yeah, and he does a lot of studies that Sargent did, or just 19th century painters do, are basically color studies to understand composition and things like that, as opposed to fully rendered paintings as well. But yeah, I think that that brings us pretty much to the end of our time schedule here. I know we're a little over by a few minutes. But if anybody has any questions or that they didn't have time to ask, you can of course feel free to email me or the school, and they'll make sure that I get your questions if you have any that remain. But thank you again, everybody, for attending. And
thanks everybody. And Garrett, I enjoyed speaking with you for 2 hours. That was fun.
Yeah,
I missed you, buddy.
Yeah, I know, right? All right, folks. Well, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will hopefully see everyone soon. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.